This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning everyone. Bruchim Abam. Welcome to the Kollel Iger de Perka here. We're running on to this morning. We're on the call-in number. We're on Zoom. We're on TorahAnytime.com. We're going to be on Kol HaLashon. So we have a very interesting subject. We're still within the days that we don't say Tachnon after the Yom Tov of Shavuos, and therefore I want to speak about a subject. It's actually a brand new topic. I never discussed it before. And comes from the Sefer of Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz. Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, the great Paitan, the author of Lechadoidi, and he wrote, aside from writing the Piyut Lechadoidi, he also wrote Svarim on Tanakh. He has a famous commentary on Megillas Esther called the Manois Halevi. He has a Perush on the Haggadah. And before Shavuos, my good friend Rabbi Yossi Brachfeld, who is involved in the publishing of the Sefer, he told me that he has this Sefer, the Shoresh Yishai of Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz on Megillas Rus. Do I want it? Of course I want it. So I sent a car down to pick it up, and I spent some time learning it before Yom Tov and over Yom Tov. So I want to share with you really an amazing approach to the Sefer Megillas Rus, something that I don't think we ever discussed. The Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, aside from being a great Paitan, who's also a great Makubal, and I'll take this opportunity, we give a shir every day at 5 p.m. on Sefer Toimer Devaira on Zoom, which is on the same ID that this shir is on. And the Rabbi of the Ramak of the Toimer Devaira was Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz in Kabbalah. Okay, so the Shoresh Yishai begins in his psicha that he wants to make it known in this small sefer that something that was introduced by Rav Shmaria HaIkrit. We're going to come to this individual in a few moments, Rav Shmaria HaIkrit, and it is so sweet, this idea, and basically the idea is, and we're going to present it right off the bat, that the entirety of Sefer Rus is actually a psak halacha. Sefer Rus, even though the Medrash says Megillah zu ein bai lo tuma v'lo tara lo iser v'lo heter, there's no halacha in Rus. So why was it written? It was written to teach the reward of those who do chesed. Nevertheless, in the opinion of Rav Shmaria HaIkrit, there is an even more basic halacha that is being transcribed and codified in Megillas Rus. And we all know that Megillas Rus is read on Shavuos for a number of reasons. Firstly, the storyline took place mitchilas ktsir chitim ad kolois ktsir sa'irim. It took place during this time of the year, during the period of Shavuos. Furthermore, it is a book about the lineage and the ancestry of David HaMelech. And we know the Yushalmi tells us that David HaMelech was nifter on Shavuos, and he was born on Shavuos as well. However, in the opinion of Rav Shmaria HaIkrit, this Sefer is a psak din, because who wrote Sefer Rus? Shmuel Hanavi, and it was written lahasir lazus vasayim me'al David Mashichenu, to remove any accusations or any false bad reputation that people were spewing on David HaMelech. And this Sefer is actually the psak halacha of Shmuel Hanavi, the author of this Sefer, and therefore the Rav Shlomo Alkabetz says that he, considering this premise so basic, is going to name the name of the Sefer Shoresh Yishai. So let's begin as follows. The Shoresh Yishai says that the purpose of this Sefer is for general purpose and for specific purposes. B'chlal, he says, this Sefer is not one of the books of the Nevi'im. Instead, it's one of the books of the Kesuvim, and the difference being, it was not written with the spirit of prophecy, but instead it was written with the Madrega of Ruach HaKodesh. And he says this is not the place to differentiate and to clarify what's the difference between Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh. However, specifically are the comments of Rav Shmaria HaIkrit. And he says as follows. He says, I say, V'ani oimer shezeh sefer klalo upratoi nichtav lahachshir as David. Was written to sanitize and to make David kosher. To teach that even though the Torah says that a man from Moav may not enter the congregation, a woman from Moav, a Moaviyah, may enter the congregation. And this Megillah is just a psak din. In other words, if we have any attorneys on today, any lawyers on the call? Let's see, I'm going to go through. If anybody wants to raise their hand. Ilan, all the way in South Africa, how you doing? Shalom Aleichem. Kenny, you're an attorney, right? So you know that. I'm sorry if I release that information here, but you know that when you're studying law, you have to study various verdicts, and you have to read through the various arguments, and then finally the law is codified. So Sefer Shmuel is actually a famous verdict given by a famous judge, and the name of the judge was Shmuel, and the verdict was, the Sefer discusses the various arguments to and against, and finally it culminates with the conclusion of the psak of Shmuel Hanavi, and that is Shmuel paskind, Shmuel and his bezdin, ubayaz hoyled es oived, ve'oived hoyled es yishai. Right, so the Megillah ends that Oived gave birth, Oived hoyled es Yishai, ve'Yishai hoyled es David. So the Megillah ends that Yishai bore David, and this is sort of the stamp of approval, the ultimate authentication and verification of David's lineage. Okay, so now this is rather strange because how many other instances in Tanakh do we find that a psak din was codified and as part of the scriptures? The answer is we find it nowhere else. Never do we find anywhere in Tanakh that there was a court case that was codified for all time as part of the scriptures. So Rav Shmaria HaIkrit basically says that this was codified for three reasons. Number one, it's a very important psak din for a very great matter. And that is namely the verification and authentication of the Davidic dynasty, including the Melech HaMashiach. So since this is so important, it was deemed worthy to be codified as part of Tanakh. Number two, it's very short. It's not a very long court case. So if it's a longer court case, okay, we'll leave it to the Gemara. But such a short verdict, there's a danger of it being lost. Similar to that which the Gemara says in Baba Basra, we know that there are 8 svarim of the Nevi'im: Yehoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, Yishai, Yirmiyah, Cheskel, Trei Asar. Now, technically, the Trei Asar should each one be a separate book of the Nevi'im, but because they're so small, we want to include them in one book so they don't get lost. Likewise, the psak of Ruth was so small, we didn't want it to get lost, so we codified it as its own book. And number three, it was codified so that we understand that this verdict was issued by such a great personality such as Shmuel. Now, what's very interesting is the Shorish Yishai. He quotes this pshat from Rav Shmaria ben Hanadiv Elio HaParnes HaIkrit. Now, in the Sefer Shorish Yishai, in this new edition, which is a very beautiful edition, in the back they give you some of the historical background of some of the personalities that Rav Shlomo Alkabetz quotes. And this name Ikrit was very interesting to me. So where do you think this individual comes from? What country does he come from? Crete, Crete, which I believe is an island off of Greece. And he was born in Rome in the year Haymem, so he was born 780 years ago. So we're talking about, he was born 740 years ago. So we're talking about, he was born in the year 1280, excuse me, he was born in the year 1280. And he was appointed the Rav in the island of Cretim, which is Crete. Candia is the area of Crete, or the main city in Crete. Hence he's called the Yakriti. And he wrote a perush on the Tanakh for about 25 years. and the only thing we have that's still extant are fragments on Shir HaShirim. So this is his thesis, and basically today's shir is going to be based on the thesis of Rav Shlomo, of Rav Shmaria HaIkrit, and he says as follows. He's bothered by the following question, because if you look in the Gemara in Yavamis, let's take a look in the Gemara in Yavamis for a moment. In number 5, the Gemara wants to know, how do we know that males cannot marry from Moav, but females can? Where does this come from? So the Gemara tells us the following account, that when Shaul saw David going out to the Philistine, and he saw this, this valiant warrior, so Shaul starting to get a little nervous, because he sees this young kid with royal bearings, and he thinks maybe this one, he could someday be the king of Israel, and he turns to Avner, the Sar Hatzava, and he says, who is this kid? So Avner says, I swear, king, I don't know. So the Gemara asks, Shaul didn't know who the kid was, but it says he loved him very much and he made him his arms bearer. So the Gemara says, no, he was asking, who's the kid's father? So the Gemara says he doesn't know who the kid's father was, but it says that Yishai was nichnas be'uchlusa v'yatza be'uchlusa. Yishai was a personality that he entered and left among throngs of followers. He was a very famous Talmid Chacham. So what's Shaul asking? Shaul doesn't know who the kid is. He doesn't know who the father is. So the Gemara says he was asking as follows. He was asking, this kid, does he come? I know he comes from David. I know he comes from Yehuda. Does he come from Peretz or does he come from Zarach? If he comes from Peretz, he'll be a king, because a king could breach through the fence and nobody could protest. And if he comes from Zarach, he'll just be a chashuva person. Says the Gemara, why is he so curious as to the lineage of this person? So he says, because when David put on Shaul's armor, Shaul was a head taller than anybody else. And the fact that the armor miraculously fit David, that was like a sign from Shamayim that unbelievably David HaMelech was sort of destined for greatness. So Shaul started to get a little bit uncomfortable, because it says, Vayilba Shaul David Madav v'midasai. And it says about Shaul, Mishich Malmala, Gavaya Mikal Ha'am. So now Doeg Kohadoimi is hearing this whole conversation, and Doeg says, what are you getting so worked up whether he's going to be the next king of Israel? I have a more important question. Forget about him being the next king of Israel. He's not even a kosher Jew. What do you mean being the next king of Israel? Because it says, Amoini v'lay amoinis, Mayavi v'lay mayavis. No, excuse me, because it says, Lo yaveh Amoini b'kal Hashem. He comes from Rus. So Avner said, what are you talking about? It's only the males that are a problem from Ammon and Moav. So Doeg said back, what are you talking about? It says, we know that there's a concept that it says, Lo yavoi mamzer b'kal Hashem, and we don't say v'loi mamzeres, so just like mamzeres is included, Moaviyah should be included. So Avner said back, no, mamzer means mumzar, anyone with that mum is possible, even the females. So Doeg says, well, you're not going to say that about Mitzri, you're going to say Mitzri v'loi mitzris. So the Gemara says that Avner said back, no, you don't understand. The specific reason why we're not allowed to marry from Moav, look where my arrow is. Do you see my arrow? The whole time against Ammon and Moav is they didn't come out and graciously offer you food and water. It's only the derech of a man to go out in public and bring food. It's not the derech of a woman to be out in the forefront. So then Doeg asked the $1 million question that nobody had an answer to. Doeg asked, the men should have brought food to the men, and the women should have brought food to the women. So Avner was silent. Avner didn't know what to do. So the king Shaul said, Sha'al ata ben mizeh ha'elem. Who is this Elem? So the Gemara asked the question, what do you mean who's the Elem? First it calls him a nar, and then it calls him an Elem? So the Gemara says what Shaul meant was, this halacha was nis'alma mimcha. Go and ask in the Beis Medrash. So they asked, Amoini v'loy amoinis, Mayavi v'loy mayavis. And Doeg asked all of his questions, and they didn't have a good answer. So since they didn't have a good answer, they wanted to paskin that David HaMelech is pasal. Boy lachruze ele. They wanted to give a kol koirei that David is pasal lavei b'kahal. Says the Gemara, Miyad va'amasa ben ish ushma Yisra HaYisraeli. Immediately, Amasa was the son of a man, and he was the son of someone, Yisra HaYisraeli. Asher ba'el Avigail bas Nachash. And then it calls him Yeser HaYishmaeli. So basically the Gemara says, Yeser girded his sword like a Yishmaelite, like an Arab. And he says, V'amar kol mi she'eno shemei halacha zu, anyone who doesn't listen to this halacha, yidakar b'cherev, should be pierced by the sword. Kach mikublani miyazdino shel Shmuel HaRamasi, have the following tradition from the Bezin of Shmuel, Amoini v'loy amoinis, mayavi v'loy mayavis. This is not a matter of dispute, this is not a matter of drasha, the way the Brisker Rav explains this, it's halacha l'Moshe misinai. Amoini v'loy mayavis, amoni v'loy amoinis, mayavi v'loy mayavis. So the Shoresh Yishai, quoting Rav Shmaria HaIkrit, asks, wait a second. According to Rav Shmaria HaIkrit, that Sefer Rus is the Psak Din of Shmuel HaRamasi, then why do we have to have this whole Shakla V'Tarya, where Doeg is asking questions? And Yeser HaYishmaeli is saying, I have a tradition from Shmuel. They should have just whipped out Sefer Rus, and Sefer Rus is the Psak Din that David is Mutter Lavei B'Kahal. What's the big Shaila? I don't understand. How could you have a question whether David is kosher? It's a book of Tanakh. The whole purpose of the book is to be Machshir David. So they should have taken out the stone edition of the scriptures. And in the stone edition, there's Sefer Ruth, and with the overview by Rabbi Nassan Sherman, and it would have said over there that David is Roy Lavei B'Kahal. What's the big shaila? Says the Sharash Yishavim Taimer Achar Shaser V'Zanichta B'Saktin Al Inyan Ros Im Lama Lo Yehaviu L'Raya Machlokes Avner V'Doeg B'Mei Shaul V'Lama Hutzuchu L'Kabalas Amasa from the Bezin of Shaul. Says Rav Shmaria HaIkrit, look where my arrow is, HaSefer Hazeh Adayin loy nichta bayomim ahim. That's because the book of Ruth was not written yet. Because the Gemara says in Baba Basra, Shmuel wrote, look at number 6, Shmuel kasav sifrei v'shoiftim v'Rus. Shmuel wrote Rus. When do you think he wrote Rus? Says of Shmuel, Mistama b'soif yamav kasvam. He probably wrote at the end of his life. So this is what happened. They didn't know what to do, and this was a teaching of Shmuel, and Shmuel taught it to Yeser HaYisraeli, Mistama b'soif yamav kasvam, u'be'ez ha'machloikes shel Avner v'Doeg al inyan Rus, adayin ha'yishmol kayam, like it says in Yevamos. Now here's the thing. You'll say, well, Shmuel wrote it in the end of his life, but maybe Shmuel was not alive during this dispute of Doeg and Avner. Maybe he already died. So we're going to see clearly in the Gemara Shmuel is still alive, because the Gemara asks that, look, Yeser HaYisraeli, this guy who is defending David, you know who he's married to? He's married to Avigail, the daughter of Yishai. So this is relevant to him as well, because if David is pasul, his wife is pasul. So the Gemara asks, the Amar Rav Abba Amar Rav Kol Talmid Chacham Shemoira Halacha Uba Im Koydem Masa Amar Sherman Lav Im Lav Ein Shayman Lai. A Talmid Chacham that they ask him a halacha after it's already relevant to him, we don't believe him. So Yeser, why do we trust Yeser? He has an invested interest here. Very nice. He says that he has a tradition from Shmuel. Okay, who says that he should be believed? So the Gemara says it's different. Shani Hacha Dah Shmuel Ubes Dinoi Kayam. You know why Yeser is believed? Because we could fact check him. Because if he says, I have a tradition from Shmuel, we could go to Shmuel's court and see, in fact, whether he's telling the truth. So since he's checkable, therefore, we're going to trust Yeser. From here we see, Rabbi Isai, that Shmuel was alive in the times of this dispute between Doeg and Avner. So therefore, says the Shoresh Yishai, it's reasonable, quoting of Shmaria HaIkrit, Shmuel wrote it at the end of his life, and at the time of the Machlokes Avner and Doeg, Shmuel was alive, like the Gemara just said. Let's see. And
Shmuel had point with David. Shmuel with David as a man.
okay, but maybe at this point in time he wasn't alive anymore. and Rus was around, meaning the Sefer maybe was around, so why didn't they pull out the book? So he's saying, no, Shmuel was still alive, and he didn't write the book yet. Now look at this is an amazing thing. Says Rav Shmaria ha'ikrit va'ani mamin, I believe in etzli by shum safek, I have no doubt, that at that time they sent Shmuel the Shaila. When Doeg and Avner were arguing, they sent Shmuel the Shaila, and they asked him the halacha. And that is when Shmuel codified the Psak Din, that Amoini v'lei Amoinis Mayavi v'lei Mayavis. And that's when he wrote Sefer Rus. He wrote Sefer Rus when Shaul began suspecting that David one day would be the next king. And he codified for all time the Kabbalah that Mayavi is Kshera.
Where does the court of Boaz come in? Because Boaz already had determined this 400 years before. Boaz determined it for himself, but it doesn't matter that he determined it for himself, because this is, at that time, Boaz darshaned, and if it's a matter of drasha, then it could be re-darshaned in every generation. Okay? Now look over here. They asked him, and then he wrote Sefer Rus, and the inyan of Rus was a very major topic, and Boaz married her b'shus bezdin hashofet. And then the Shaila was readdressed in the times of David. And therefore, Shmuel recorded Ve'ela Toldois Peretz to be mechabed him. And in other words, why in the Megillah does the Megillah end off that David comes from Peretz? That's not really relevant. It's to teach that David is meyuchas after the great Peretz, and he's not connected to Moav. We don't follow his Moabite ancestry, and this is all contradicting and falsifying those who want to say otherwise. Now, when Shmuel wrote Sefer Rus, it was Nisames, the Kabbalah of Amasa, who said, I have a Kabbalah from Shmuel. So now everybody knew that Amasa was saying the truth, because there's a book that not only is it Amasa's word that Shmuel said it, but Shmuel himself recorded it. And this was actually recorded for all time in the Tanakh. Okay. Now comes Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, and he says amazingly, now this is all the thesis of Rav Shmaria ha'ikrit, that after Amasa and Avner and Doeg argued, they Yeser HaYisraeli and Amasa said their tradition, and they asked Shmuel, and Shmuel codified it. Says the Shoresh Yishai that in his opinion this whole thesis is rooted in a medrash called Medrash Shmuel, not to be confused with Medrash Shmuel and not to be confused with Medrash Shmuel. There's a yeshiva Medrash Shmuel, that has nothing to do with anything. There's a Sefer on Pirkei Avos, Medrash Shmuel, Reb Shmuel Di Uzida, also not connected to what we're about to say. There's something called Medrash Shmuel. It's a medrash on Sefer Shmuel. So it brings over here that when Shaul saw David going out to the Philistine, he said to Avner, who is this? And the Medrash says he didn't know who he was. He's Shaul's arm bearer. But since he saw the head of the Philistine in his hand, he says to Avner, go find out what family he's from. If he's from Peretz, if he's from Zarach. And Doeg says even if he's from Peretz, he's from Rus, he's not Roy Lovei B'Kahal. So Avner said, what do you mean, Amoni v'lei Amonis, Mayavi v'lei Mayavis? So they asked him all the questions. So Amar lei Avner, halacha nesalma mimcha, we forgot the halacha. Say ulamad mishmuel ubezdina. Here, according to the Medrash, Amasa did not say, I have a tradition from Shmuel. Amasa said, let's go ask Shmuel. And they asked Shmuel, and he said, Hada mana. L'cha loy mishal doyeg minhu. First Shmuel said doyeg is an apikoros. Ve'eno yoytze b'shalom in ha'olam, he will not leave the world in peace. You cannot say such a thing because women are modest, they should be indoors. Only men usually go out and not women. And also the other taina against Moav was that they hired Bilam, men hire, women don't hire. But says the Shoresh Yishai, this approach of Rav Shmaria ha'ikrit is merumas in the Medrash Shmuel. What do we see from the Medrash Shmuel? Look over here. Harei beferush sheholchu etzel Shmuel. We see from here, it's clearly, we wanted to say, well, maybe Sefer Rus was written, but if you say that no, very likely Shmuel wrote it in the end of his life, but we know for sure Shmuel was alive at the time. From the Gemara, you could have said maybe it's just a tradition he had from Shmuel. But from the Medrash, we see he actually went to Shmuel, and therefore it is clear that Shmuel was still alive. Now, Rabbi said, based on this thesis, Rav Shlomo Alkabetz gives us a tremendous insight into the Gemara in Baba Basra. So if I were to ask you, we mentioned before that there are 8 books of Nevi'im. How many books of Kesuvim are there? Well, if you have 5 books of the Chumash, 8 books of the Nevi'im, that leaves you with 11 books of the Kesuvim. And it should be very easy to remember. You have 5 Megillas. You have the Sifrei Emes. Sifrei Emes are Iyov, Mishlei, Tehillim. And then you have Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, and Divrei Hayamim. But what most people, I would say almost nobody knows the correct order of Kesuvim because it does not appear in your regular Tanakh. It appears in the Gemara. Sidron Shel Kesuvim, Rus, Tehillim, Iyov, Mishlei, Kohela, Shir Hashirim, Kinnis, Daniel, Megillas, Esther. This order does not typically appear in a regular Tanakh. And then finally, Ezra, Nehemiah, Divrei Hayamim. So the Gemara has the Gavaldiga Kasha. Frek the Gemara, according to the Manda Amar, Iyov was in the times of Moshe, right? There's an opinion that Iyov is in the times of Moshe. I'll tell you, Gavaldiga Vart. They say over from Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, there is an opinion that Iyov Lo Hayav Lo Nivra. Remember that opinion? That Iyov never lived. Who is the man who suffered the most in the history of the world? Iyov. So Reb Chaim Shmulevitz would point out, think about how deeply he suffered. He suffered so much. People were so sympathetic to him. People could not care about his pain to the extent that, you know what they said about him? He didn't even exist. That's how much pain Iyov had. The most painful thing in the world is when you suffer and nobody even acknowledges that you suffer. That's, Reb Chaim Shmulevitz's take, I guess, al derech hatzachos. But if you look in the Gemara asks, according to the Manda Amar, Iyov lived in the times of Moshe, so Iyov came first chronologically. Likdamei le'Iyov bereisha. Says the Gemara, Aschule beparanusa le'meschalinan. We do not begin with punishment. And Iyov lived a hard life, so we don't begin with Sefer Iyov. So the Gemara asks, Rus nami paranusa. What do you mean? Rus is also punishment. There was famine, and Elimelech died, and Machlon died, and Kilyon died, and Boaz's wife died, and then Boaz died. It's not a happy book. Says the Gemara, Paranos de Islay Achris. It's a punishment that has a good ending. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, what's the good ending of Rus? That David HaMelech came out. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Lama Nikor Shema Rus. Why is she called Rus? Sheyatsa Mimena David, that David came out from her. Sherivahu LaHakadosh Baruch Hu, that she satiated God b'shiros v'sishbachos with song and praise. Okay, so why do we begin Ksuvim with Rus? Because Rus is not really punishment, because it speaks about, it's something that has a good ending, namely, the good ending is the birth of David HaMelech. Like the Gemara says, why is she called Rus? Because David came out of her. Comes Tosfos, and Tosfos has a kasha. I understand why Rus comes first, because Rus is not a bad story, but then right after Rus should be Iyov. I understand you can't start with Iyov, because Iyov is a bad story. So start with Rus and then go straight to Iyov. Why do we go to Rus and then to Tehillim? The Omari, because what's the acharis of Rus? That David HaMelech came out of her. So right after Rus, we say Tehillim, which are the shiros, the sishbachos of David HaMelech. The Omari mishum sha'achris shel Rus haya achris sheyatz mimenu David. The end of Rus was the end that David came out. Sharivahu LaHakadosh Baruch Hu, who satiated God b'shiros v'sishbachos. Therefore, right after Rus are the shiros v'sishbachos of David. Now comes Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, and he says, let's see if I could find it. In number 11, based on the pshat of Rav Shmar Yehoikret, we could taste a new sweetness in Tosfos, because Tosfos is perhaps not merely saying that we start with Rus because Rus is a good story, and then we go to Tehillim because Tehillim is the Acharis Toiv of Rus. It's more than that. It's if we would just have Sefer Tehillim, then people would question Tehillim. Hey, who wrote Tehillim? David? Maybe he's not Roy Lavai B'Kahal. Maybe he's not a kosher Jew. Maybe he's not worthy and fitting for such a achievement to write Tehillim, and therefore we start with Rus. Rus is the psak din and the authentication and verification of David's lineage. And then once David is verified and authorized, now we could go immediately to Tehillim. So it's not only that Tehillim is the Achris Toiv of Megillas Rus, but Rus is actually the stamp of approval to David. So it's actually a very beautiful idea to understand that in Tanakh it should be Rus and Tehillim are juxtaposed one to another. Firstly, as the simple words of Tosfos suggest, that the Achris Toiv of Rus is Sefer Tehillim, and secondly, Rus is Machshir David to allow Tehillim to be sort of accepted as the great work that it is. Now, says Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, based on this approach, we can understand another beautiful pasuk in Sefer Tehillim. In Tehillim, it's written, Parak Mem, pasuk Ches. Aza Marti, then I said, Hine Vasi, behold, I have come. B'Megillas Sefer, in a Megillah, Kosav Olai, it is written upon me. So David HaMelech is saying, Aza Marti, once upon a time I said, Hine Basi, now I'm coming. But now I realize, B'Megillas Sefer Kosav Olai. I'm written in a Megillah. How does the Gemara interpret it? Darash Rava, it's a Gemara in Yevamos Daf Ayin Zayin, Ma'idich Oza Marti, then I said, Hine Basi b'Megillah Sefer Kosav Alai. Amar David, Ani Amarti, I thought, Ata Basi, that I came now. Look at Rashi. B'shah shenem shachti Ata Basi l'gdula. I thought when I was anointed that I'm first coming to greatness now. Umi karoiv paskuli gedula, and I was only assigned greatness now. V'lo yadati, but I didn't know. Megillah Sefer Kosav Alai, that I was already sanitized in a Megillah. Which Megillah? Hasam Ksiv Hanim Tza'os. In Megillas, in Parshas Vayera, the Malachim tell your two daughters that are found. And in Tehillim it says, Matzasi David Avdi, I have found David my servant. Says Rashi, David thought he was only Nimshach then, but he didn't realize that David's greatness was already assigned to him from the Megillah. Which Megillah? Parshas Vayera. Where in Parshas Vayera? Hanim Tza'os. It says by the daughters of light that they were found, and a remez to David. So the question is, why is Parshas Vayera called a Megillah? So for that we have to go to a Gemara in Gittin. The Gemara in Gittin says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Bena, Torah Megillah Nitna. The Torah was given Megillah after Megillah. Shenemar, like it says, Oz Amarti, then I said, Hine Basi, I have come. The Megillas Sefer Kosav Olai. Listen to Rashi. Rashi in the Gemara says, Kach Amar David, I thought when Shaul challenged me and Doeg to passel me, and they testified about me in the Beis HaMedrash, I thought then I became kosher. But really I was already kosher from the pasuk in Bereshis, because it says, Shtei b'nai secha anim tzais, in the Zechus of David, who it says about them, Matzasi David Avdi. So we see the Chumash is called the Megillah, that's Saraya Torah Megillah Nitna. So that means the Gemara in Gittin and the Gemara in Yevamos is interpreting, David said, I thought I only became kosher when they testified about me in the Beis HaMedrash, when Yisra testified about me, when Amasa testified about me, that they had a tradition from Shmuel, and I didn't realize I was already kosher from the Megillah. Which Megillah? It's a raya, the Torah was given Megillah. I'm written as kosher in the Megillah. Which Megillah? Parshas Vayera, Shtei b'nai secha hanim tza'os. Says Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, but according to Reb Shmaria HaIkrit, we can learn a much simpler pshat in the pasuk of Rus. You know what David HaMelech means? Oz amarti hine basi. I thought I'm kosher because they testified about me now. But the truth is, my kashrus is written in the Megillah. Which Megillah? Megillas Rus. In other words, we can learn a little bit differently than the way the Gemara learns in Gittin and in Yavamis. The Megillah does not refer to the kashrus of David in Parshas Vayera of Shtei B'nai Secha HaNimtzais. The Megillah instead refers to Megillas Rus. And he says, therefore, Rav Shlomo Alkabetz says, "Ve'im mashek damu." Based on this premise, ein safek, there's no doubt, ki ala Megillah hazoy samru. V'kavanosoi lefi shiuroi, kol yamai hayisi mischoyle u'mitztar al yichusi. My whole life, I was in turmoil over my lineage, and I was mesupik, and every day I was afraid, maybe they're going to distance me, maybe they're not going to hold me as kosher. But when Shmuel wrote me in the Megillah Sefer, I was calmed. V'amarti hine basi b'kol. When I was written in Megillah Sefer, then I knew for sure that once I'm codified, in other words, so long as it's a tradition, maybe the next Bezdin will argue and have a vacillate and have it change their course. But once it's codified as part of Tanakh, David HaMelech could rest assured that would be his ultimate psak. And then Rav Shlomo Alkabetz says that this is also seems to be the way the Medrash in Rus Rabbah interprets the pasuk. Rabbi Yitzchak Pasach, Oz amarti hine basi shira hayisi tzarch laimar shabasi. Oz refers to a shira, like it says Oz Yashir. The Megillah Sefer, the Megillah asher tzivisa lo yavoyu b'kohalach. Which Megillah? Peretz Chetzroin Ram Aminadav Nachshoin. So the Medrash also seems to be learning that the Megillah referred to in this pasuk is not the Megillah of the Chumash, but rather the Megillah of the Megillas Rus, and this is what he brings from a Medrash, a Lekach Tov, and the Medrash in Rus Rabbah. Now, let me try something. Okay. So, Eli, now you're back on my screen. I see you now. Okay, so now we're going to go to the end of the Megillah, and the end of the Megillah says that, and learn Rav Shlomo Alkabetz's approach. Actually, Rav Shlomo Alkabetz now borrows Rav Shmaria HaIkrit's approach to explain the closing psukim of the Megillah. In other words, if the whole purpose of Megillas Rus was a psak din of Shmuel, to sort of verify the authenticity of David, Rav Shlomo Alkabetz then goes through the lineage of David at the end of the story and explains why each generation was needed to, so to speak, address another question you may have about David, and by saying the precise lineage, it's sort of verifying and authenticating David's ancestry. So, for example, the Elo Toldos Peretz Amar Rab Abba Bar Kahana. Anyone whose name is doubled, he has Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. And the question is, what about Terach? Then he has Olam Haba. Amar Lahem Af Hi Loi Tavrad. Amar Rav Yudim Bar Rab Abba Bar Kahana Va'ata Tavazav Shalom Bisu Sheish Lav Chelama. In fact, Terach did have Olam Haba. Now, Rav Shlomo Alkabetz uses this approach to explain why all of these generations were listed here. He says, "V'oidani oimer ki kivan sheshmol Hanavi b'yachas hazeh l'shakech tchlunas ma yidum b'davar hazeh." Since Shmuel was trying to put to rest any complaint anyone would have on David, v'ani afarshim kolech b'mkam. I'm going to explain each one. Rishoina. One matter that you could ask is that Boaz seemed to have swindled this Toiv guy. Toiv guy comes to the Bez and he says, "I'm the older Goyal, I'm going to marry her." And he says, "Anoichi Egel, I'm going to do it." And it seems like Boaz, using Chachmas HaTorah, swindled him out of the Yibam. He said, if you take her, you're going to have to take the field. I don't know, it might not be a good idea. Maybe you can't afford it. Because clearly, he was, Toiv, plenty of money, was going to do the job. And somehow, in the end of the day, in the 11th hour, Boaz comes and steals her. So maybe that was dishonest. So maybe you'll ask, hey, David, you come from some kind of, very slick businessman called Boaz, who somebody else wanted to do it, and he he twisted the path that plenty of money should marry her after he said Anochi Egal. So therefore the Navi traces David back to Paretz, because that's what happened with Paretz. Remember Zarach sticks out his hand first, and they put the red string around him, and what happened? And in the 11th hour, Paretz comes, bursting out ahead of Zarach. And he was the Bechar. So that's exactly what Boaz did. Pliny Almoni said, I'm going to do it. And in the 11th hour, Boaz, following in the pathway of Paretz, he won the race in the 11th hour. And Paretz, it says his name twice. Ve'ela toldos Paretz. Paretz. That means he has Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. Why? But it wasn't right. Zarach was going to be the Bechar. He swindled Zarach out of being the Bechar. But the answer is no. When it comes to Ruchnius, you have to make every effort. And if you could, so to speak, chap Ruchnius for yourself, as long as you don't hurt somebody else, don't say, I'm going to be the nice guy. I'll let him do the mitzvah. No. This is your own life. Chayecha koidem. Don't let someone else do it. You do it. So the same way it was okay for Peretz, and that is indicated by the fact that it says his name twice. Don't have any tainas on Boaz. Hey, why didn't he let Toiv, plenty of money, seal the deal? The answer is, it's because v'al derech zeh piresh hachacham. I'm sorry, look over here. V'lo yisasi geo mizeh boishes of gam. Ki adam karoiv etzel atzmei lahagia lashleimus. Basically, when it comes to ruchnius, you got to take care of your own skin, and that is what Boaz did. Let's go a little further. Chetzroin hoyled es ram. Now, there's another guy who Chetzron gave birth to, and that is Yerachmiel. In Divrei Hayomim, the name Yerachmiel is mentioned. Ubnei Chetzron, Yerachmiel, Ram, and Kolev. What happened to Yerachmiel? He's out of the picture. Do you know any Yerachmiels in the end of Rus? No. But he married a Goya, Yerachmiel. And her name was Atara. And the Chacham, the Chasr, Yehuda ben Shushan says, Yerachmiel would have been the Bechar, and maybe Mashiach would have come from him because he's the oldest in the Davidic dynasty. But he married a Goya and he lost it, just for some fleeting pleasure. Says the Sharash Yishai, in my opinion, this is addressing another question you might ask about the lineage of David, and that is, I have a question. Why in the world would God make David come from a Moaviyah? Even if she's mutaras, okay, fine. You want to say she's mutar, fine. You want to say there's a tradition from the Bezin of Shmuel, fine. But you couldn't find a better girl to produce Malchus Beis David. Go to Beis Yaakov of Lakewood and find a girl who's a chveis. Her father actually is not a convert. We had to get a Moabite convert. It's very nice, so he's kosher. But get a girl whose father is like a Rosh Hashiva, 10th generation Yushalmi. What are you going to Moabites for? Right? The lav mishnas chasidim hi kasher nichbal mal. It's not really such a nice thing. Therefore, it says Chetzroin gave birth to Ram. And what happened to Yerachmiel? Why is Yerachmiel not on the list? You know why? Because he married a Goya. So wait a second. If he married a Goya and he lost, he's not listed because he married a Goya? So if he married a Goya and he's not listed, then why is Boaz listed? Boaz married Rus. It must be that Rus is different than a regular Goya. Rus must have been endorsed by the Rebbeinu Shalom. Meaning, the reason why we list the lineage of Ram, who is the son of Chetzroin, is to show how Yerachmiel was outcast because he married a bad woman, And we would obviously have done the same thing to Boaz if not for the fact that obviously Rus was a tzaddikas. So that's the next line in the lineage. Okay, let's move on a little bit further and we'll wrap it up. Aminadav gave birth to Nachshon. Now let's read the Targum. V'Aminadav oiled Yas Nachshon. V'Nachshon Rav Beis Abba Beis Yehuda. Nachshon was like the leader of the family of Yehuda. V'Nachshon oiled Yas Salma. Now, who's Salma? He's a tzaddik. Who's Salma min Beis Lechem, a toifa devatila b'noi pruzdin da'osav Yeravim chayav al orche. He was the guy who removed the centuries that Yeravim ben Nevat put up to stop the Jews from being oile regal. Fine. This is also critical in the lineage of David. And that is, Nami was afraid that maybe Rus would not be zoicha to build the Malchus Beis David, because maybe she did not act fast enough. Maybe she dilly-dallied in presenting herself for Yibum. Maybe she didn't show enough zrizos. Maybe there was something lacking in her zrizos and her energy in becoming a ger. So therefore the Navi is miyaches her after Nachshon. What does that teach me? What does that show? If she's coming from Nachshon, and Nachshon, of course, was the first one to jump into the water, and she was coming from Salma, who was Mavatal Avodah Zarah. Yoni, how you doing, Yoni? Then that shows that obviously she had the midah of Zrizos. She had in her DNA Zrizos of Kedusha and energy of Kedusha, and that is why this was all brought in the lineage of David HaMelech. Now, let's wrap it up. Number 23. Salmon gave birth to Ivtson. Ivtson, of course, is Boaz. He's a tzaddik, that in his chus, Klal Yisrael was saved from their enemies, and because of his prayer, the famine in Israel stopped, and Boaz gave birth to Oived. Oived is the one who served God wholeheartedly. By the way, the Shar Yishai explains that what does it mean he saved the Jewish people from famine? That's what it refers to, that the famine wasn't over really, and because of Boaz's tefillah, Hashem ended the famine early. And finally, in the last pasuk, it says in the Targum, Oived gave birth to Yishai. Yishai is called the Nachash. Why is Yishai called the Nachash? Oived gave birth to Yishai, he's called the Nachash, because there was no cause or excuse that he should ever die and be given to the Malach HaMaves, and he lived a very long time until God said, look, I got to take you away because I promised the Nachash that when Adam and Chava ate from the Eitz Hadas, then everybody has to go one day. Now, why is the Targum telling me this? The pasuk says his name is Yishai. So the Targum says, oh, by the way, he's called Nachash. Why is he called Nachash? He's called Nachash because really he had no reason to die, and he lived very long, other than the fact that everybody has to go one day. What's that got to do with the price of tea in China? Not that you should buy tea in China or get anything from China ever again, but it's just an expression. But look in the last comment of the Sharash Yishai, ve'ein safek ki hoisa kavanas hamatargem. There is no doubt that the kavana of the Targum is that the pasuk is coming to teach who gave birth to who, to recognize and to establish the tzidkus and the wholesomeness of the whole Davidic line, that they're all tzaddikim, they're all members of the Sanhedrin, they're all gedolei hadar, they're all zrizim, and to give credence and credibility to the Psak Din. Who wrote Rus? Shmuel. When did he write it? After the question was posed to him by Avner, Doeg, and Amasa. After Amasa said, I have a tradition from Shmuel, Shmuel put pen to paper and he composed Sefer Rus. Why is it part of Tanakh? Because it's such a important Psak Din. They didn't want it to get lost. And this is what David HaMelech thanks Hashem. Az amarti hine basi b'Megillas sefer kasav alai. David said, I thought I was only nichshar later on in history. Little did I know that the book of Rus is the book that authenticates me for all time. Okay, Rabbi said this is the approach of Rav Shlomo Alkabetz quoting Rav Shmaria HaIkrit. And great to see everybody. Have a amazing day. Shkayach. Shkayach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.